You're listening to Meet the Experts on 3OJ Community Radio Melbourne. Today we'll be discussing a topic posed by one of our listeners via Twitter. Sexuality education should be standardised regardless of the religious affiliation of the school. Thank you for a great topic at MP83. Today our experts are Jacqueline Scott and Olivia DiCello, who bring with them 2 PhDs, one in gender studies and the other sexuality studies, and many years' experience as primary school teachers. Jacqueline, Olivia, welcome.
Thank you, Amanda. It's great to be here.
Yes, it is. Let's get right into it, shall we? The type of school that students go to should not be a determinant of their sexuality health. Firstly, I think we should define sexuality education, as it is a relatively new concept that is quite different to the sex education that we and most of our listeners will have received. This shift in terms from sex to sexuality aims to support the understanding that sexuality education is not just about biology, and it definitely isn't. I'm just going to read something from the Victorian Government Education Department here. They say that sexuality education teaches love, safer sex, abstinence, respect for others and oneself, diversity, personal rights and responsibilities, relationships and friendships, effective communication, decision-making, and risk behaviours. At a primary school level, students are taught the skills to talk about their feelings, relationships, and bodies while gaining an understanding of the importance of respectful relationships. They are taught how babies are conceived and born, to understand their body parts, and are prepared for puberty. Once students reach high school, their sexuality education is split into 3 units. These are sex, sexuality and gender, pressure, power and sexuality, and safer sex issues. I'm sure it is now clear that sexuality education encompasses far more than just biology and sex, instead teaching a wide range of essential concepts and skills that supports all dimensions of health.
Yeah, look, you're absolutely right, Olivia, and sexuality education is indeed essential in all schools. But I think the main question here is why? Well, recent studies conducted by the Victorian Government tell us that 93% of young people learn most about sex and sexual health from their schools as they are scared, embarrassed, or ashamed to discuss sex and their sexuality with their parents. We must also remember that some students do not have safe or reliable parents or guardians with which to have these conversations at all. Therefore, it is a school's responsibility to teach its students a comprehensive, true and relevant sexuality education that will ready them for the realities of the world and enable them to make safe and positive decisions. This is especially important when research tells us that over the last decade, the amount of young people still at school who are sexually active has significantly increased. You cannot deny it is happening, and so we must work with the facts rather than against them. Furthermore, the sexuality education model provides opportunities for students to be respectful of diversity and feel confident in their own gender and sexuality, whatever that may be.
Yes, Jackie. A resource used by schools in Victoria to inform and aid sexuality education lists some reasons for its importance. Firstly, it answers the natural questions and curiosities that students have through remaining relevant to the age group. Research has found that 85% of parents want sexuality education in their child's school due to the inescapable sexual themes posed by the media and other outlets that children and young people are exposed to. It also provides opportunities for parents and their children to be more comfortable discussing these matters under the guise of schoolwork. Sexuality education helps to break down gender rules and stereotypes that students may be facing and struggling with. Finally, sexuality education can be protective against sexual abuse as it helps to identify respect, safety, and rights over one's body. So then, with all this being said, why should some young people not have the same access to the quality sexuality education as their counterparts? Yes, their religion may be different, but they are still experiencing the same changes and issues. They will have the same questions, however, unfortunately, theirs may go unanswered.
Or sometimes they're answered incorrectly. Unfortunately, some aspects of sexuality education taught in religious schools may be false, fabricated, damaging, or even dismissive of some topics altogether. This can have direct and indirect effects on students' physical and emotional well-being, and often confuses and eradicates many students' identity and self-worth.
If I could just please interrupt for a moment. We've just received a text from Sharon, whose daughter goes to a Catholic school. She argues that religious schools teach her child better values and that sexuality education encourages teenagers to engage in sexual relationships. What would you say to her? There is no definitive evidence that sexuality education encourages sexual activity more than abstinence-based programs, Sharon. In fact, a review made by the World Health Organization found that the only effect sexuality education has on intercourse is the capacity for young people to abstain until they are comfortable, and then effectively use contraception, communication, and safe practices when they are sexually active due to being well informed.
Yeah, look, I'd like to add on to something there. As for values, Sharon, you're right, they are important, but they should be taught alongside standardised sexuality education that is inclusive to all students. I'm just going to read something here from the Victorian Equal Opportunity Act that I think is quite crucial in understanding this topic. It says that religious schools and organisations are legally allowed to discriminate against students on the basis of their sex, sexual orientation, lawful sexual activity and gender identity if the discrimination conforms to their values. This can be so damaging to students, and I asked Sharon whether she thinks her daughter's self-worth is more valuable than her virginity. Just last year, actually, at Fair Hills High School in Knoxville, Melbourne, which is a Christian school, Year 7 girls were given religious propaganda in place of sexuality education in the form of a booklet entitled Science and Facts. So this booklet claimed that it was scientifically proven that girls are needier than boys in a relationship and always want to be close. And I'm going to quote word for word, I've got an extract from this booklet here. It said that having multiple sex partners is almost like tape that loses its stickiness after being applied and removed multiple times. So that the more you have, the harder it is to bond to the next. I think that's pretty disgusting, and especially when it's applied only to women. And the statement that is given there is inherently sexist and encourages ideas of internalised misogyny whereby women determine their self-worth and that of other women on the basis of their sexual activity. It's extremely dehumanising for women and reinforces patriarchy, gender roles, domestic and emotional labour and violence against women. Not to mention it is in no way a scientific fact.
You're absolutely right, Jackie. It's deplorable. And religious censorship of sexuality education can be just as damaging for boys. Just a few months ago, Year 9 students at St Francis Xavier College in Berwick were ordered to destroy a page in their health workbooks which was meant to provide a starting point for discussions about premarital sex and homosexuality. The school argued that such discussions were more suited to religious classes, where they are no doubt able to use their values to discriminate against students based on their sexual activity and orientation. How does this position those students at St Francis Xavier College who engage in non-marital sexual activity and question heterosexuality? It reinforces the idea that their identity and any discussion around it is taboo and shameful. These are just two recent local examples, but it is worthwhile noting that there are many cases of students' sex, gender, sexual orientation, and sexual activity being shamed and othered in religious institutions, which often leads to instances of abuse and suicide. I'm glad you brought that up, Olivia. I have a text from Ross earlier asking where the evidence is that religion-affiliated sexuality education is harmful to students. Can either of you back up these claims?
Yeah, well, thanks for bringing that up, Ross. I was actually involved in a national study back in 2010 at La Trobe University linking homophobia to depression and suicide risk. And I'll just run through some of the things that we found. So we found that 61% of same-sex attracted young people in Australia have experienced some sort of verbal homophobic abuse. They have double the risk of suicide compared to those who have not experienced homophobic abuse, and those who have experienced physical homophobic abuse have triple the risk. And most surprisingly, I think, is that 80% of this abuse occurs in schools, a place where young people are supposed to feel safe. According to the report, young people who used any religious language in filling out the survey were more likely to rank their school as very homophobic, more likely to feel bad about their same-sex attraction, more likely to have experienced social exclusion or homophobic language from friends, and most worryingly, I think, is that they're more likely to self-harm and have suicidal thoughts.
I'm really sorry, but I'm going to have to cut you off there. We are out of time. Is there anything you would like to add before we have to say goodbye?
Yeah, look, I think it's important to note that the sexuality education that we're giving in schools needs to include all dimensions of health. And today, unfortunately, we've only had time to touch on the mental, spiritual, and social health aspects. Obviously, there are severe physical repercussions for students as well. And that sexuality education absolutely needs to be standardised across all schools, whether they are religious or not, so that all students are given the ability to access information, promote their own and others' sexuality health, and become more literate in health overall.
Well, Jacqueline, Olivia, you've definitely convinced me. You've been so great today. I was wondering if next week you could come back and discuss maybe some solutions or successful models that could be used in schools.
Yeah, look, I'd love that personally. What about you, Olivia?
Oh, that would be great. I'd love to come back, Amanda.
All right, well, I guess we'll see you then.
Thanks for listening. This has been Meet the Experts on 3OJW Community Radio, Melbourne.